What if everything you thought you knew about America's beginnings was only part of the story? Most of us were taught that the story starts with the English, Plymouth Rock, the Pilgrims, Thanksgiving, and the 13 colonies clashing with Britain to win their freedom. But what if I told you that before those English settlers set foot on New England soil, other communities, Latino and Asian, had already been shaping the land that would one day be called the United States? What if I told you that the first permanent European settlement wasn't Jamestown, but a Spanish city in Florida? That long before the cowboy became a national icon, Mexican vaqueros had already created the skills, tools, and traditions that would later define the American West? What if I told you that in the swamps of Louisiana, Filipino fishing villages were thriving before the United States was even a nation, and that Chinese porcelain was already in California long before the gold rush? These facts don't make it into our history books, but they are part of the truth. The question is, why don't we learn about them? Is it because these stories complicate the simple myths America likes to tell itself? Is it because they reveal that the country was never a blank slate waiting for the Pilgrims, but a crossroads of cultures from the very beginning? In the next half hour, we're going to travel back through time and across continents, tracing the forgotten role of Latino and Asian communities in shaping the foundation of early America. We'll uncover their presence in cities and forts, their influence on culture and politics, their blending with native and African peoples, and their invisibility in the official record. By the end, you may realize that the America you thought you knew, the one in neat chapters and clear beginnings, is only a small piece of a much more fascinating and complicated story. To understand the Latino role in early America, we have to go back, far back, before there was a United States, before the 13 colonies, before Jamestown. The Spanish crown had already been building settlements in the Americas for decades. In 1565, they founded St. Augustine in Florida, a city that still exists today. That's more than 40 years before Jamestown, and more than half a century before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. St. Augustine was not a small outpost barely clinging to survival. It was a real town, with churches, military fortifications, farms, homes, and families. Its streets bustled with Spanish soldiers, administrators, indigenous allies, African laborers, and mixed families of all kinds. And when pirates and rival European powers attacked, the town endured, defended by the stone fortress Castillo de San Marcos. That fortress still stands as proof that Latino presence in what would become the United States is older, stronger, and more enduring than most of us are taught. And St. Augustine was just the start. From Florida, the Spanish moved westward, building missions and presidios across the continent. In New Mexico, Santa Fe became a capital city by 1610, decades before Boston even existed. In Texas, missions like San Antonio de Valero, better known as the Alamo, were built more than a century before the American Revolution. In California, the mission chain stretched from San Diego to San Francisco, with each mission serving as a hub of agriculture, religion, and cultural blending. The Spanish and Mexican presence gave us place names like Los Angeles, Colorado, Nevada, El Paso, Santa Barbara, and Sacramento. These aren't borrowed words. They are reminders that Latino communities lived and thrived here long before English-speaking settlers arrived. The Spanish brought more than names. They brought techniques that shaped the land itself. They built acequias, irrigation channels that allowed desert regions to bloom with crops. They introduced horses, cattle, sheep, and new forms of ranching that transformed native economies and ways of life. They introduced adobe architecture, blending indigenous building traditions with European forms, and as they settled, they married into native communities, creating mestizo families who would become the backbone of the Southwest. Catholic traditions mixed with indigenous practices, producing hybrid festivals that are still celebrated today, like Dia de los Muertos. By the time Anglo settlers began pushing westward in the 1800s, Latino communities had already created a rich, layered civilization across vast parts of what would become the United States. To ignore this is to ignore centuries of history that shaped the land long before the American Revolution. The Latino role in shaping America wasn't just about towns and names. It went deeper into culture, economy, and even the revolution itself. Let's start with one of the most iconic symbols of American culture, the cowboy. We tend to think of the cowboy as an Anglo invention, rugged men riding across the frontier, lassoing cattle, living by their own code. But the truth is, the cowboy tradition comes directly from the vaqueros of Mexico. Vaqueros were expert horsemen who developed the techniques of herding cattle across open land. They created the lasso, the saddle with a horn, the spurs, and many of the riding techniques that Anglo settlers later adopted. Even the clothing, the wide-brimmed hat, the bandana, the chaps, were adaptations of vaquero gear. Words like rodeo, lariat, mustang, and corral all come from Spanish. In other words, the cowboy, perhaps the most American of all images, is in fact a Latino creation at its core. And the influence didn't stop with ranching. Latino traditions shaped food. Tamales, tortillas, and enchiladas were staples in the Southwest centuries before Tex-Mex appeared. Latino traditions shaped music. Spanish guitars blended with indigenous and African rhythms, creating folk styles unique to the Americas. Latino architecture shaped the very look of the land. Missions and adobe homes defined the Southwest, long before English colonial styles spread west. And while these cultural contributions were profound, Latinos also played a political role in America's founding. During the Revolutionary War, Spain provided critical support to the rebelling colonies. Bernardo de Galvez, the governor of Spanish Louisiana, became one of the unsung heroes of American independence. From New Orleans, he opened supply lines that provided guns, ammunition, medicine, and uniforms to George Washington's army. He personally led military campaigns against the British along the Gulf Coast, capturing Mobile and Pensacola. These victories weakened Britain and diverted their resources, directly aiding the American cause. Without Spanish support, the revolution would have been much harder, perhaps impossible, to win. Yet most Americans have never heard of Galvez. His portrait hangs in the U.S. Capitol, but his name is rarely taught in schools. This pattern, significant Latino contributions erased from the mainstream story, tells us something. It tells us that the version of history we learn is not neutral. It was shaped to elevate certain groups and minimize others. To see the full story of America, we have to bring figures like Galvez back into the narrative. While Latinos were shaping the Southwest and fueling the revolution, Asian communities were also making their mark. Most people assume Asians didn't arrive until the mid-1800s with the gold rush and the railroads. But in reality, Asians were present in America much earlier. The Manila galleon trade connected the Philippines to Mexico from the mid-1500s to the early 1800s. These massive ships carried goods, silk, porcelain, ivory, spices, across the Pacific. From Mexico, Those goods spread north into California and beyond. Archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain fragments in California missions dating back to the 1600s. Clear evidence that Asian goods were already present centuries before the gold rush. But it wasn't just goods, people came too. Filipino sailors and laborers often worked on the galleons, and some of them escaped. In the 1760s, groups of Filipino men fled from the harsh conditions of Spanish ships and settled in the swamps of Louisiana. There, they built villages on stilts above the marshy wetlands, fished and harvested shrimp, and created sustainable communities that became known as Manila villages. These communities lasted for generations, with descendants still living in Louisiana today. In many cases, Filipino men married African or Creole women, blending traditions into unique cultural forms. And Louisiana wasn't the only site of Asian presence. Indian and Chinese sailors sometimes jumped ship in Mexican ports and made their way north. By the 1700s, small numbers of Asians had blended into Mexican and indigenous communities in California and the Southwest. America was not a closed bubble waiting for English settlers. It was part of a global web of trade and migration that tied it to Asia as much as to Europe. The story of Asians in America is older, deeper, and more complex than most of us realize. One of the most fascinating parts of this story is how Latino and Asian communities blended with indigenous and African peoples to create multicultural societies that existed long before the official birth of America. In Louisiana, Filipino fishermen intermarried with African women, producing families that carried on fishing traditions while blending languages, foods, and customs. In California, Mexican ranchos sometimes included Chinese or Indian laborers, producing workforces and communities that were more diverse than the history books admit. In Texas, Tejano families forged an identity that was neither fully Spanish nor fully indigenous, but something uniquely their own. These blended communities contributed to the rich cultural fabric of early America, but they rarely appeared in the official record. Why? Because after the US-Mexico War in 1848, when the US annexed huge swaths of Latino land, the new American government often stripped Spanish-speaking families of their land and rights. Overnight, they were treated as foreigners in their own homes. Their history was downplayed, their contributions ignored, their identities erased. Asian communities faced similar invisibility. The Filipino villages of Louisiana went unrecorded for centuries, almost erased from maps. Chinese sailors who blended into Mexican or indigenous families often disappeared into census categories that refused to acknowledge them. This erasure wasn't random. It reinforced a narrative that America was built by Europeans alone. But if you look closely, the fingerprints of Latino and Asian communities are everywhere, in the foods we eat, the music we hear, the places we live, the languages we speak, and even the people we've become. Invisibility doesn't mean absence. It means we haven't been taught to look. So, what happens if we tell the story of America differently? Instead of a straight line from the Pilgrims to the Revolution to Manifest Destiny, we see a web of overlapping cultures. We see St. Augustine standing strong in Florida as proof of Latino permanence. We see Santa Fe as a thriving capital decades before Boston. We see vaqueros riding across Texas long before cowboys entered folklore. We see Filipino fishermen in Louisiana swamps, Chinese porcelain in California missions, and Mexican rancheros shaping the land. In this story, America isn't an Anglo project alone. It's a multicultural crossroads from the very beginning. Recognizing this doesn't erase the English colonies. It enriches the story by showing how global, diverse, and interconnected America was. And it forces us to confront why these stories were erased. They were erased because they challenged the narrative of ownership. They were erased because they showed that America was never the creation of one group alone. By recovering them, we gain a more honest, inclusive, and inspiring picture of our past. History becomes not a myth, but a mosaic. Latino and Asian communities were not outsiders waiting to join America later. They were part of the foundation itself. From Spanish forts and missions to Filipino villages, from vaqueros to porcelain trade, from military victories to blended families, their presence shaped the land, the culture, and the nation itself. Their stories were erased not because they were minor, but because they complicated the myth of a simple Anglo origin. But the real story is richer, more layered, and far more powerful. America was born multicultural, born global, born as a crossroads of peoples and traditions. And when we embrace that complexity, we embrace a fuller, more authentic vision of who we are. So what do you think? Should the stories of St. Augustine, Bernardo de Galvez, the Manila villages, and the vaqueros be taught alongside the Mayflower and Plymouth Rock? Should we honor the Filipino fishermen of Louisiana the same way we honor the Pilgrims of Massachusetts? What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.